Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome on this lovely, beautiful spring day, which has finally come to Hanover, at least for one day. My name is Ken Yalowitz. I'm the director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding, and I'm very, very pleased on behalf of Andrew Samwick, the director of the Rockefeller Center, to welcome all of you today to this program, a very important program on a very important subject, which is being co-sponsored by the Rockefeller Center and the Dickey Center. I've been asked to make one very important announcement before we go any further, and that is you have the next 10 seconds to please turn off your cell phones. So I will wait for 10 seconds till all cell phones are off before continuing. Okay. The second announcement is that the director of the Hood Museum has asked me to announce that in November at the Hood Museum there will be an exhibition of photography from the George Eastman House International Museum of Photography and Film. They will have a multimedia photography exhibition entitled Darfur, Darfur, which is designed to prompt international support for the prevention of further destruction of life in Darfur. So be on the lookout for that. The date, I believe, is not yet set, but that will be coming in November. And now I take great pleasure in introducing a very valued colleague, Dr. Lee Witters, MD, who is the Eugene W. Howard 1921 Professor of Medicine and Biochemistry at the Dartmouth Medical School, and Lee is also Professor of Biological Sciences at Dartmouth, and Lee will introduce our speaker. Dr. Witters.
The heart and soul of our speaker today needs no introduction to this audience, all of whom probably regularly read his columns in the New York Times and his online blog. Some particulars of his background are however, noteworthy and should be mentioned. He grew up on a farm in Oregon, graduated from Harvard College and Oxford University, the latter on a Rhodes Scholarship. He's lived on 4 continents, traveled to 120 countries, in all 50 states, every Chinese province, and every Japanese island. His biography notes he is one of the very few Americans to travel at least 2 times to every member of the Axis of Evil. Although his biography doesn't say whether that included Harvard. And he's on his way to Cornell, so maybe he might put another on the list. He joined the New York Times in 1984 and writes regularly on several subjects that many of us look forward to eagerly twice a week. In 1990, he and his wife, who's also a Times journalist, Cheryl Udun, won a Pulitzer Prize for their coverage of the Tiananmen Square democracy movement. He repeated that success in 2006, winning a second Pulitzer for his commentary. In his columns concerning, among other subjects, sexual slavery, women's rights, Pakistan, and poverty, he has used his eyes to open ours, illuminating many areas of social inequality and injustice that seem to escape the attention of many. I think many of you would agree, though, that his voice about the Darfur genocide has been the voice of conscience about this ongoing human tragedy, a voice we're privileged to hear in person today. I, for one, particularly glad he has come to talk to our students. His commitment to the student generation through his now annual Win a Trip contest, only for those who wouldn't mind, in his words, a bed-bug-infested mattress in a malarial jungle as hungry jackals yelp outside, offers to our future thought leaders a chance to see directly what he has seen with his own eyes and to be inspired by those visions. The Kristof eyes in traveling the world to places our politicians and leaders seem to shun have captured inequity, injustice, suffering, and horror in the existence of many global citizens. He has used his eyes to let us look inside the lives of others in a most intimate way through his columns, books, and his blog. But I would ask, as Susan Sontag did in her last book regarding the pain of others, what right do any of us have to look at such a horror? Are we spectators or are we cowards? Ms. Sontag writes, there is a shame as well as a shock in looking at the close-up of a real horror. Perhaps the only people with the right to look at images of suffering of this extreme order are those who could do something to alleviate it or those who could learn from it. The rest of us are just voyeurs, whether or not we mean to be. Nicholas Kristof is no coward. Nicholas Kristof is no spectator. Nicholas Kristof is no voyeur. Nicholas Kristof, as one of the world's important voices of human virtue and conscience, has brought his eyes to Dartmouth today to let us all see and learn more about Darfur, the first genocide of the 21st century, spurring, hopefully, each of us to do something about it. Welcome to Dartmouth, Nicholas Kristof.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I've got to say that sitting there, it sounded a little bit suspiciously like a eulogy. So I was sort of pinching myself and just wanted to make sure I hadn't walked into my own funeral somehow. I thought about responding to that calumny about Harvard, but I don't mind going into North Korea or Iraq, but I think rolling a grenade through Dartmouth I won't go there. So I'm just gonna let that go. I'm particularly glad to talk about Darfur to an audience that includes a lot of students because, frankly, university campuses have been real leaders on that issue of Darfur. You'd think that on issues of genocide that the White House or members of Congress would be the leaders, but historically that has not been the case. And if you look at Woodrow Wilson in 1915, looking the other way as Armenians are being slaughtered in the Ottoman Empire, or FDR ignoring pleas to bomb rail lines leading to death camps, or the Clinton administration refusing even to use the word genocide during Rwanda for fear that then they might have to do something, you see that kind of moral leadership has never really come from our political elites. There was actually some sense that it might have ended up differently this time for a couple of reasons. President Bush's, George W. Bush's constituency was very attuned to what was going on in Sudan because the religious conservatives had championed the plight of southern Sudanese who were being treated brutally. So they were very aware of what was going on in Sudan. And President Bush himself had read a report about President Clinton's inaction during Rwanda. And in the margins, he'd scrawled, "Not on my watch." And for those of you who know the lawn signs and those green armbands, that's where that expression comes from. There is this sense that President Bush, at some intellectual level, really, intellectual level, there is a sense that President Bush, at some level, really aspired to do differently, to do things differently and better than the Clinton administration had done during the Rwandan genocide. And yet, now we are 4 years along, and it really hasn't been substantially different. I should say that there is also an alternative theory about the meaning of that expression, "not on my watch." There is an alternative view that President Bush had taken off his wristwatch. I think you see where this is going. He laid it on his desk, and some aide had put this report about Rwandan genocide on top of his wristwatch. And so he was trying to convey that, reports should never be put on top of his wristwatch again. But I think we can give him the credit, the benefit of the doubt there. I think that he really aspired to do better, and yet the way politics and international diplomacy works, it just didn't happen. And I think that if more is going to happen, and I really think that there are opportunities to resolve and end the genocide, then it's going to have to fundamentally come from all of you and people like you all over the country, that is where the leadership is going to come from. Now, it's obviously a little bit strange for a New York Times columnist to have this obsession with a remote place in the middle of nowhere in Sudan. And I have a show and tell to sort of explain how I became interested in that originally. I think I can master this. Pause. I had, several years ago, at the beginning of 2004, I had heard that there was a big refugee crisis building up on the Chad-Sudan border. Didn't know much about it, but there was some other stories I wanted to do in the area. And so I went out there, and I got to an oasis on the Chad-Sudan border. There were 30,000 people who'd been driven out of their homes in Darfur, and they were sheltering under trees there without getting any assistance. 30,000 people, no toilets, no food, no water, no help. But I did what journalists do. I went from tree to tree to talk to people and to get their stories. The very first tree that I went to was the one that this young man was under. He and his family had been in a little village. The Air Force had attacked at dawn. Then several hundred of this Janjaweed militia had attacked. His parents had been shot dead. He had been shot in the neck and in the jaw and left for dead. And his brother had been shot only in the foot and had managed to escape. So that night, the brother came back to go through the pile of bodies and to bury the dead, and found this man still alive and carried him on his back for 49 days to get to this oasis. That was the first tree. Under the very next tree was this woman. Her parents had been killed in front of her and their bodies thrown in the village well to poison them, which is something that is routinely done to make these villages uninhabitable. Then her husband and the menfolk had temporarily escaped. A few days later, the Janjaweed tracked them down and killed all the men in the clan in front of them. Under the very next tree were these two little kids. Their parents and siblings were killed, or the parents were killed. The siblings have vanished. We don't know what happened to them. They haven't been seen since. Presumably they're dead. And that little girl is looking after her baby brother. They were alone under a tree, alone there in the world. Under the fourth tree was this woman, Zahra, and her husband had been killed. She'd had two small babies. They'd been pulled out of her arms, killed in front of her. She and her two sisters had been kidnapped for a week and gang raped. Each of the sisters had then been murdered, and Zahra had been mutilated on the leg to scar her forever as a rape victim, to stigmatize her forever. And I think what really got to me was those were the first four trees where I did interviews. Those were four adjacent trees. And everywhere, as far as I looked in every direction, there are more trees and more people under them with stories just like them. And it was really at that moment that the brutality of what was going on and the scale of it really got to me. And after you've seen that, and once the victims become real to you, then it's just very hard to go off and write about all kinds of other issues that columnists are supposed to write about. This is a woman that I met in the biggest... Oh, can we turn the sound down? Maybe I can do that. Turning the sound down? What do you know? She was in the biggest camp called Kalma in Darfur. She'd been gang raped by 8 men, her husband killed. She just wanted to get to a camp to save her children. Her youngest was a little infant. She traveled across the desert, got to the camp, and then Sudan was not allowing new arrivals to register at the camp and to get help. And so a few days after she got to the camp, her baby died. This is what you see all across Darfur now. These people had been burned out of their village called Tama in South Darfur. These women they'd been driven out of, this is Tama, this is the village that had been theirs, been burned. This is what you see everywhere. The huts are mud wall with thatched roofs. The roofs burn easily. The babies often get thrown into the burning hut. The elderly or anybody who can't run, they're often also thrown into these burning huts. And you travel across Darfur now for miles and miles and miles, and that's all you see, these burned out villages. No sign of anybody. That's me. And it's just incredibly eerie. You see, the detritus, these clay pots that have been left behind. This, on one visit, the Janjaweed attacked a village, and I've got to say that at this point, the Janjaweed, to me, I hadn't actually interviewed one at this point. The Janjaweed just seemed to me evil personified. And I got to a village in the morning, and that night the Janjaweed had attacked that very village. What they hadn't realized was that there were some people in that village who actually had guns and who fought back. And this was a member of the Janjaweed, and he was shot in the back. And the Janjaweed then fled once they realized people in the village had guns. So he was left right outside the village, lying on the ground. And then there was another, whom you'll see in a moment, who was also caught. The other man's horse had been shot out from under him. And then he'd been hit with a machete and captured. This is their other prisoner. And you see there, the other guy in particular, this one was older. The other one was a teenager. This one, I think he said he was 20. They'd been paid to join the Janjaweed, paid to attack the village, to join the village. And, we think of genocide as something incredibly ideological and racist, and there is a racist element to it, but these are the foot soldiers of it. They're paid to do it. And a lot of the members of the Janjaweed are just like that. This is something that really hurt me. This is on my most recent trip to Chad. I hadn't seen it before. The Janjaweed bayoneted this man's eyes out. Instead of shooting him, they gouged out his eyes with bayonets. It's the first time I've seen it, but since then it's happened repeatedly. And maybe it's wrenching to see this, but the single thing that just got to me the most was this man's child, who was at the foot of the bed. You can't see him. He was a little kid and was looking at his dad with obviously sympathy and love, but also just horror and revulsion. And to see a child look at their dad with that kind, and obviously seeing a monster, just tore your heart out. Just can't tell you how wrenching that was. And as I said, now this gouging out eyes is becoming more widespread. His sister was also, she didn't have her eyes gouged out, she was shot. She was younger, she was 16 or something. Here he is again. This man I have so much respect for. His wife was infirm, couldn't walk. And so when the Janjaweed attacked their village, he didn't run. I mean, everybody, the Janjaweed are attacking, everybody's running for their lives. He wouldn't leave his wife behind in the hut, and so he stayed with her. And the Janjaweed found them, and so they threw him to the ground and lit a bonfire on his back. And his wife, who, could barely walk, she was trying to push the Janjaweed away. She was pleading with them to spare his life. And finally, she jumped on the fire and put it out with her own body. And at that point, I think the Janjaweed just got embarrassed, and they said, oh, he's going to die anyway. Let him go. And she saved his life. Here he is in a little clinic with no anesthesia, obviously, getting the burns scraped off. This is in a little village in Chad called Kukugangareni, and this is what the local people have to fight against Janjaweed with RPGs and Kalashnikovs, bows and arrows. After I took that video, then the Janjaweed came back and destroyed the village. There's nobody living in that village now. Likewise, that village where the two Janjaweed were captured, they were driven off the night before I arrived by these people in the village with guns. Well, a few days later, they came back, better equipped, better armed, and destroyed the village, and it's now also completely uninhabited. This is a woman called Suad, and I'm going to tell you about her at the very end, but just, look at her for a moment. I have incredible admiration for her courage, and I'm going to tell you a lot of really depressing things, but just look at her and remember that face when I come back to Suad's story at the end. Well, let me back up a little bit and just kind of explain to how we get to the point where you've got soldiers running around, gouging out people's eyes with bayonets. Darfur, as you know, is this huge, vast area in the far west of Sudan. It's all Muslim, but the cleavage there is threefold and overlapping. One is between Arab tribes and non-Arab tribes. That overlay on top of that is a racial one, that in general the Arab tribes tend to be lighter skinned, and in general the non-Arab tribes who speak African languages tend to be darker skinned. And in general, many of the Arab tribes are nomadic herdsmen, and many of the African tribes are settled farmers. So you also have, the same kind of historic tension that you had in Europe and in America between the herdsman versus the farmer going on there. And the same conflicts exist, similar or tensions exist elsewhere in northern Africa. There has been increasing competition for water and forage because of a drying of the area that may well be linked to climate change. Both computer models and certainly the facts on the ground show a certain amount of drying of the area, which means fewer wells, less place to water animals, to get irrigation for your crops. So it may well be that this is one of the first battlegrounds that results from climate change. And in this competition, the Arab government in Khartoum, in the capital, supported the Arab tribes. And it wasn't all the Arab tribes. There are some Arab tribes that haven't been involved at all, but where there were tensions, the Sudanese government supported the Arab tribes. And they began to attack the African tribes. And there were three in particular, the Fur, the Zagawa, and the Masalit. Then in 2003, the African tribes organized an incipient rebellion to demand that this stop, to demand more resources for schools and roads and everything else. And once this rebellion began, then at that point the Sudanese government really just went berserk and decided that the simplest way of resolving this was to wipe out the African tribes in rural Darfur. And I want to emphasize that this isn't a case of Sudan being kind of Taliban-style extremists. They're not. They're really very pragmatic people. They faced a problem in Darfur, this rebellion, and they weighed the costs and benefits of how to deal with it. And they decided that the most cost-effective counterinsurgency approach was to just slaughter an awful lot of people, to wipe out rural Darfur, and that would also teach a lesson to other parts of Sudan. And they decided that the easiest way of terrorizing people and driving them out wasn't just to kill people, but also was something that it took us a while to be aware of, but that was mass rape. Rape is enormously stigmatized in the area. So this was actually a very shrewd strategy. They managed to terrify people without getting them to complain or to report the rapes to international community. So Sudan didn't get into trouble, and yet they terrorized people, and they also broke up the traditional hierarchy, the tribal hierarchy, because there was a sense that if the tribal leaders couldn't prevent rape, then they were completely failing the system. And we really began to notice the extent of the rape only when so many women began to become pregnant. And also, the Janjaweed were systematically what they called marking women. They were, I showed you Zahra, and her leg had been mutilated. There was a systematic pattern of marking women as rape victims so that they would forever be known as rape victims and dishonored and the clan dishonored and so on. And Sudan will say, well, there's rape in any conflict situation, but that is not what this is. This is not rape as a byproduct of chaos and conflict. This is a policy of rape. It is a policy of mass rape, and you see it across hundreds of miles, different areas in Darfur. And women who tried to report it or to get even medical help were systematically brutalized. There was, for a long period, women who tried to report rapes were then arrested for adultery because they were, by acknowledging that they had had sex outside of marriage, and by not being able to furnish 4 adult male Muslim witnesses to that act, they were, in effect, by the Sudanese government's point of view, acknowledging adultery, and they were being arrested and imprisoned for it. But mostly it was an effort to just keep this quiet. I showed one of the women I showed early on. I mentioned that was in Kalma camp, the biggest camp in actually, it's now been superseded, but at that time was the biggest camp in Darfur with 100,000 people. Right before I visited that camp the first time, there was a student named Hawa, a 19-year-old student, and she had been gang raped. Her friends took her to a clinic run by a French aid group, and somebody evidently saw her being taken in and reported it to the police, and then a bunch of police vehicles roared up to the clinic. It was run by a group called Médecins du Monde, and there were 2 French nurses inside. The police barged in. The nurses tried, incredibly courageously to keep away the police, but, what could they do? And the police just bowled him over, took Hawa. They took her to the police hospital, chained her to a cot, one arm and one leg, and charged her with adultery. You know, you can imagine that after that, no other woman who ever gets raped is ever going to seek medical care or tell anybody about it again. And likewise, if somebody does get post-exposure prophylaxis, ideally within 24 hours of a rape, or failing that, at least 72 hours, you can substantially reduce the possibility of HIV transmission. And so NGOs, aid groups, wanted to bring in these PEP kits, and Sudan barred them from bringing them in, which is, again, a systematic effort to make their policy of rape more effective. Now, the government will claim that it's true that there are killings going on, but that this is tribal conflict. It's something that has gone on for a long time, and that this isn't the government. And it's complete hogwash. We know, well, the rapists, the killers, routinely, I mean, they wear Sudanese military uniforms. They talk about getting paychecks from the Sudanese government. We know the Sudanese Interior Minister has gone out and addressed the Janjaweed. The jails have been opened up for recruitment by the Janjaweed. The Janjaweed commanders use Thuraya satellite phones, which we can monitor. They talk to the Interior Ministry. We have various documents from the Sudanese government that describe the degree to which Sudan has organized the Janjaweed and commissioned them to engage in these attacks. But, you know, maybe the moment when the degree to which this was really just a Sudanese policy came home to me was when I was coming back from that village that I first showed, the village of Tama, that had been wiped out. There had been 50 people killed in Tama. I talked to one woman whose picture you saw, and she'd had her baby taken from her and killed in front of her. As I was driving back from Tama, on a fairly major road, there were Sudanese police and troops all along the way, and checkpoints. And I saw along that road a convoy of Janjaweed. And at the checkpoints, the Sudanese government just waved the Janjaweed through because they were all, you know, they were all the same. Meanwhile, not only was I, of course, stopped at every checkpoint, but at one checkpoint, one of the scariest things that has happened to me in Darfur happened at, there was they took my interpreter, who was this 19-year-old kid who I'd hired from the local university. It's very hard to find English speakers to interpret because they've been all snapped up by the aid groups. But I found this student, and he agreed to interpret for me. And the police said, okay, we're just going to hold him for investigation. Nothing to do with you. You go on. It seemed to me and to my interpreter that their investigation was going to end about 5 minutes later with a bullet in his head. It was very scary. And so I pleaded with them to let him go. I tried to bribe them to let him go. You know, I said we couldn't figure out how to get back. We couldn't go. But when they saw that we weren't going to go, my photographer and I weren't going to go without the interpreter, then they detained us too. And they kept us all in this little interrogation hut. And on the wall, there was this mural with one man lying down or maybe being tied down, and several others impaling him with this sort of spear or something. And there is no place you'd less want to spend, you know, some time. It was really a bleak place, but it's much more complicated to do something unpleasant to somebody with white skin and a blue passport. And so they called their commander, and he came after a while, and finally he let us all go, including my interpreter. But to see these checkpoints just wave through the Janjaweed and meanwhile try to grab my interpreter just underscored to me the degree to which Sudan is completely complicit in everything that's going on. I get periodically some skeptical questions, and I think even if people don't articulate them, maybe they think them. So let me get a step ahead of you and articulate them and raise them and try to address them. One is, sure, this is awful, but is this really genocide? That's a pretty strong word. And it's true that there have been some people who have looked at this and who have said that it falls short of the standard. In my first column about Darfur, I used the term ethnic cleansing, and then what happened was then I went and read the 1948 Genocide Convention, and I thought, no, this is genocide, and since then I've been using it. And in fact, I think most people who have looked at it agree. The problem is that really because of the Holocaust, we think of genocide as an effort to exterminate a people. And that is not really what is happening in Darfur. Sudan is not determined to exterminate every last Zagawa or every last Fur, every last Masalit. There's a pretty determined effort to kill boys and men, but sometimes women are killed, sometimes old people are killed, sometimes they're not. It's not a real policy of extermination. But in fact, Raphael Lemkin, who coined the word genocide, didn't intend for genocide to be a necessary component of it. And in fact, the Genocide Convention definition likewise doesn't envision extermination as being a component of it. And the pattern more commonly is something like Armenia, where vast numbers of people are killed by their ethnicity, because of their ethnicity, but there isn't an attempt at extermination. It sure seems to me that Darfur meets the definition. The second skeptical question I get, and actually a student at Cornell once put it to me pretty bluntly, and she said that in effect, Darfur is terrible, but there are a lot of really bad things happening all over the world. And there's already obviously a certain amount of student activism about Darfur. Shouldn't we be active on these other issues? And there is a certain validity to that. We don't know how many people have been killed in Darfur, but a few 100,000 is probably a pretty good estimate. It may be as high as 500,000. We just don't know. But in contrast, every year, somewhere between 1 million and 3 million people die of malaria worldwide. And so, in other words, the 4-year death toll in Darfur is 500,000 or less, is substantially less than the margin of error of 2 million annually from malaria worldwide. And malaria obviously gets very little attention. So you can argue that maybe we should be focusing our efforts on malaria or on AIDS or on all kinds of other things. The most lethal conflict since World War II has actually not been Darfur or any of this. It's been Congo. 4 million people have died in Congo since 1998, and mostly of diarrhea and just of the chaos that is unfolded there. But I've got to say, I've been to the Congo, I've seen people dying of AIDS and malaria and everything else. And I think we do need more efforts on all those things. But nothing has shaped me more than going through Darfur and talking to parents who've had their kids tossed onto bonfires because of a government policy and because of their child's tribe and skin color. There really is something, I think, different about genocide. And I think fundamentally we all have within us a moral compass, and it is shaped in part by a degree of human suffering, but it's also shaped by human evil, if you will. And evil is one of those words that is a little bit out of fashion. President Bush uses it, And he's right about that. I mean, you go to Darfur or to Chad or to Central African Republic now, that is evil, what is going on there. And that is what moves the moral compass, and that is what I think makes it different. And, that is what makes the Holocaust resonate with us today. What is important about Anne Frank isn't that she was a teenager who died. It's that she was a teenager who was murdered because of a government policy based on her ethnicity. There's something about genocide that represents such a tearing of the human fabric that I think it is incumbent on us to in turn respond and stand up to it. And that's why, I hope that we'll be more active on these other issues, on malaria, on AIDS, on the Congo. But I think that a starting point has to be when a government adopts a policy of genocide. And that gives it a historical significance and a resonance and an obligation on us that we have to see through. And the final skeptical question that I think people sometimes feel is that, look, it's a terrible problem, but it's been going on for years. It's in a country where we have very little leverage. We can't send ground troops into Sudan now. We can't stop it. What's the point? We can wear these wristbands or put up signs, but what does it actually achieve? And there too, I think that that's actually a mistake. As I'll say later, I'll talk about policies, and I think this actually is soluble. But aside from that, if you simply go to Chad or to Darfur, you see hundreds of thousands of people who are alive today who wouldn't be if it weren't for student activism and for those lawn signs. There have been hundreds of thousands who've been killed because there hasn't been more activity, but there are also hundreds of thousands who are alive because of what activity and pressure there has been. Albert Camus once said something to the effect that we may not be able to live in a world where no children are tortured, but we can achieve a world where fewer children are tortured. And I think that that is exactly the challenge of Darfur and makes it worthwhile to reduce the number of people killed in Darfur. Well, what have we done? The Bush administration, to its credit, it has used the word genocide, which the Clinton administration did not do, and it's been pretty good about providing aid. We provided more than $2 billion so that if a family gets out of Darfur, across the border into Chad, they get medical care, they get food, they get a tent, and that is what is keeping so many people alive. Periodically, there'll be some meek statement of protest or an effort to adopt a resolution in the UN, and all of that helps as well. And, all that is great, but I've just got to say that after year, you go back to Darfur and you visit the same clinics and you see doctors, one after another, carving bullets out of kids. And, it's great that they're there, but when you see this on every visit, you just think that maybe it's time not just to fund more doctors carving more bullets out of more kids, but to actually stand up and take more action. And the time that this really just hit home to me was when an American friend of mine who was an aid worker in Darfur, a young American woman, the age of a bunch of youth students, she'd been working in Darfur for a while, and she was for a time working in a area where the Janjaweed was also active. And the Janjaweed, they want food distributed and things like that as well. And so they sometimes let the aid workers in. And it was, of course, hard to get the African people there to talk to my friend and to the other aid workers about what was going on. But finally, my friend got two sisters to tell their story. And they spoke about how 50 Janjaweed had moved into their family's compound. There was an extended family. They'd moved into the family compound and forced that family to, in effect, be their slaves. Cut wood for them, cook for them, get water for them, kill their livestock to feed them, and in the case of these two sisters, to sleep with them. And finally, their father, after several days of this, had screwed up his courage. He was terrified, but he screwed up his courage, and he went to the commander of the Janjaweed and got down on his knees and begged him and said, please, all the rest of us, we'll do whatever you want, but just please let my daughters go. And at that point, the sisters said, the Janjaweed had called them in, had called the two sisters in, and had beheaded their father in front of them. And this is going on, of course, in an area where aid workers can reach. And so my friend asked these two sisters, well, what can we do for you? And, we've got food, we can give you medical care, what do you need? And the two sisters said, we don't want anything that you can provide, we just want to die. And, at times like that, it's great that we're giving out food, and it's great we're giving out medical care and bandages and plastic sheeting, but it feels pretty incredibly inadequate when 4 years into this, that's all we're doing. What could we do? I think that there's a mistaken perception that short of sending in troops, there's nothing much we can do. I happen to think that sending in ground troops is not an option, and even if we had troops available, would not be wise. That in the aftermath of Iraq, we are viewed with such suspicion in the Arab world that if we were to send troops into a country, in an Arab country that has oil, every Sudanese Arab and every Arab in neighboring countries would be persuaded, would be convinced that we were just going in to grab oil to make Sudan safe for Israel. We would give the Sudanese government an excuse to rally support and be more popular than ever. So I don't think that sending in ground troops is feasible in the aftermath of Iraq. But there is a real option to reach a peace agreement in Darfur, and that is fundamentally the way that this is going to end, if it is going to end. And there was a peace agreement between Northern Sudan and Southern Sudan in a separate war. And that was really a hard thing to reach because Southern Sudan basically wants independence. The people in Darfur don't. They want more resources. They want to stop being killed. They want to go back to their villages. They want a pot of money to start over. You can imagine both sides coming to an agreement. And in fact, last May, both sides came very close to an agreement. We pushed a little bit too hard and too fast and got a flawed agreement that ended up making things worse. But it would be very possible to reach an agreement, and in part that's going to require more pressure on the Sudanese government to make concessions that will enable the rebels and the tribes of Darfur to sign on to that agreement. We can apply more pressure on Sudan in a lot of different ways. Finally, we're talking about economic sanctions, banking sanctions of a kind that have been very effective against North Korea. And we can really disrupt Sudanese trade finance. And it's unbelievable that we're only now beginning to get around to that. We can impose a no-fly zone from the neighboring country of Chad. There's a French air base at a town called Abéché. And U.S. military planners have looked at that. They know exactly how we would impose it. We wouldn't keep planes in the air at all times. We would use our satellite monitoring when Sudan uses one of its Air Force planes to bomb a village, we would then, after the fact, go and destroy that plane on the ground, and it could be done quite cheaply. And it would be one more way of imposing a cost on Sudan, making the Sudanese government lose face, and making them more inclined to make concessions. We can raise the issue on the international agenda. We can hold President Bush can hold a summit in Europe about it. He can invite other countries to Washington to discuss it. He can bring Darfur refugees to the White House for a photo op. He can give a primetime speech about it. We need to get other countries involved. He can raise this issue on our agenda with China, which has really played a shameful role as protector of Sudan on the UN Security Council. We can raise this issue with Arab countries. If Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Libya put more pressure on Sudan, that would make a tremendous difference. And indeed, Saudi Arabia now is beginning to be more active in a way that I think is going to be really helpful. So we do have a lot of tools, and I think we just haven't used them. Why not? I think there are a few reasons. I think one reason, I think President Bush was very proud of his ability to reach that agreement that ended the North-South war in Sudan, and I think he was afraid that if he put too much pressure on Khartoum, that might unravel. In fact, it's the opposite, that now the North-South deal threatens to unravel because of Darfur. I think that he also valued the intelligence sharing that Sudan has offered since 9/11. Sudan has genuinely cooperated, providing intelligence on al-Qaeda and other groups. That's useful. But the head of the Sudan's intelligence agency, who we have brought to the CIA headquarters in Langley, is also one of the architects of the genocide. We should be able to raise that issue, to raise genocide as well. And I think the third issue is simply that on any given day, the administration isn't really sure what to do. They're afraid that if they raise the issue on the agenda and they don't actually stop it, that they'll look powerless. And so on any given day, it's easiest just not to do anything at all. And so 4 years along, that's more or less what they've been doing. Well, the upshot is that now we've spent more than $2 billion providing relief, but this is a genocide that is actually getting worse. It's getting worse in two ways. Within Darfur, you're seeing more and more chaos, and aid groups are now beginning to have to pull out. And the aid groups are in just a terrible situation because over the last year, 11 aid workers have been killed. Recently, there have been more attacks on aid workers, including sexual assaults on aid workers. And, aid groups have to look after their own staff. On the other hand, if they pull out, thousands and thousands of people are going to die for lack of health care, hunger, and just because if you don't have witnesses, then the slaughter will ramp up even more. But aid groups are pulling out. Just yesterday, 7 aid groups announced they were retreating from an area along the Darfur-Chad border because of attacks on them, including one person who was beaten nearly to death. It is in critical condition. So it's getting worse in the sense of chaos, of aid workers pulling out. It's also getting worse geographically. It's gone from genocide in an area the size of France to genocide in an area the size of Western Europe. Chad is falling apart. A number of those images, including the fellow with the bandaged eyes, that was in Chad. And Central African Republic is the same. And essentially, it's chaos spreading throughout these countries. I visited villages in Central African Republic where, in one village, for example, everybody had been forced to flee into the bush. There, they don't have wells, they don't have food, and so the night before I arrived, 2 kids had died. One of hunger, and the other was a nursing infant, and the mother didn't have milk, and so the baby had starved to death. And so you're seeing that pattern. It's not kids being shot necessarily, it's just kids dying of all these ancillary consequences of chaos and instability. I've been sort of looking out at you, and I see people kind of grimacing, and I know it's incredibly hard to take these stories, and I apologize for that. I will say, though, that if you think it's hard to hear these stories when you're sitting in a lecture hall at Dartmouth, it is 10 times harder to hear them from the victims directly in Darfur, and it is 1,000 times harder if you're a victim to tell it to somebody, to recount how your child was killed, or if you're a victim of sexual violence, to describe that to some foreign man who shows up. And it's 1,000,000 times worse to actually go through those experiences that they describe. The only thing that is actually easy is actually to pick up the phone and call the White House, or to call one's member of Congress, or to go to savedarfur.org, or there's a Dartmouth campus organization on Darfur to get active in that. That is the one thing that really is a lot easier. I mentioned Suad at the beginning, the woman who I asked you to remember her face. And she, people always ask, they say it must be incredibly depressing to go through these places, and it is, but people like her are, in a sense, the happy side to genocide. And it sounds crazy, but for every brutal atrocity you see, you also see the best of humanity as well. It really brings out not only the worst and most evil of people, but also the very best. And Suad she was from South Darfur. After her village was attacked, she fled into Chad, into a camp called Gozamir, which is well into Chad. All of Darfuris. At first it was safe in Gozamir, but then the Janjaweed have been steadily going into Chad as well, surrounding the camp. Partly because of the international pressure, they don't dare attack the camp directly, but women need to go to get firewood to cook their food, and they get that, of course, by leaving the camp. And when they do, the Janjaweed attack them and rape them. And that is such a pattern that I asked the obvious question: well, why is it that the women go out when they're vulnerable to rape? Why don't the men go out to get the firewood? And the answer was equally obvious, that when the men go out, they're killed. The women are only raped. So Suad was out getting firewood, and she had with her younger sister, Halima, who, if I remember right, was 11. And Suad knew all about the dangers of gang rape. Her next-door neighbor had been, who I believe was 12, had been kidnapped by the Janjaweed for a week, gang raped during that period, and has been crippled ever since as a result of that. But Suad, when she saw the Janjaweed coming, and she told her sister Halima, run. You run back to camp. I'll run the other way and create a diversion. You run back to camp. Don't look back. And that's what she did. And Halima did get back to Gozamir camp and was safe. And Suad, ran the other direction and was caught. Was gang raped by 8 people. And, was finally carried back on a stretcher. The rapes are unbelievably brutal. But she did manage to show this incredible courage and real kind of moral decency, if you will, in the face of something so awful. And then also was willing to tell me about it on video, to let her name be used, because it was her way of fighting back against the Janjaweed, to let her story be known, despite all the stigma. And So when I think of people like Suad, who have everything to lose, and yet find that moral courage to speak out and to do what they can about Darfur, I just hope that we in this country can, at no cost to ourselves, become more active and make those phone calls and write those letters and sign up for a campus organization or go to Save Darfur or just do all the myriad little things that in our own little ways can match what Suad does over there. So with that, thank you very much. And
time for some questions, and I'm going to let Nick choose.
Yeah, I think we have some mics roving around.
And there's some roving mics. Yeah.
Okay. When you wait for the mic, and if there's somebody else with a mic at that end, why don't you just go ahead and choose somebody, and then we'll go to that question next.
Can you elaborate on China's involvement?
Sure. China, since 1993, has been a net oil importer, and it's very nervous about its oil supplies. It knows that in any conflict with the U.S., the first thing we're going to do is cut off that oil to put pressure on its economy, to make its economy grind to a halt. And so it has been trying desperately to get as much redundancy as it can in oil sources around the world, and Sudan is one of those. About 60% of Sudan's oil now goes to China. 8% of Chinese oil imports come from Sudan. And in exchange, China has been the diplomatic protector of Sudan in the UN Security Council. People periodically ask, why the UN doesn't do more. Effectively, it's because China in particular has threatened to veto any firm resolution before the Security Council. I must say that there are other countries, including Russia, that haven't been helpful as well, but China has been the strongest supporter of Sudan on the Security Council. I think that it would be helpful, actually, if we would simply allow, every time China has threatened a veto, we've then stopped the resolution from going forward. I think it would be quite useful to let it go to a vote. And if China is willing to veto, then let it veto and do that before the world. China actually has only once in its history, since 1971, when it went on the Security Council, has only once actually used its veto. I think they bluff more than they bite. But China has been the great protector. So we need to apply more pressure on China. That's a real vulnerability. China also, by the way, has been furnishing arms to Sudan. And so those AK-47s that are used to shoot kids in Darfur, those are Chinese AK-47s. China has 3 arms factories in Sudan. There has been more pressure on China in recent months. There's been a campaign also in recent months by Mia Farrow and others to embarrass China over the Olympics and to brand the Olympics as the Genocide Olympics. And it's not a campaign to boycott the Olympics. That would not work. But it is a campaign to use the Olympics as a way of embarrassing China. And partly for that reason, I think China has been more active diplomatically recently. And partly for that reason, I think Sudan has been more cooperative and has agreed tentatively to let in an initial group of UN peacekeepers. We think, touch wood, we'll see. But I think there has to be a lot more pressure on China, and then I think China will in turn put more pressure on Sudan, and that's going to be very helpful.
Hi. We started today hearing about a quote from Susan Sontag, sort of talking about photography. I'm a big fan of hers. And then you actually showed quite a bit of media in your presentation as well. So obviously, you both have something to say about the effectiveness of media in combating things like genocide. But could you maybe say a bit more about the
Sure.
role of cultural institutions? I actually work at the museum here. And could you actually maybe comment a little bit more on the role of cultural institutions in combating things like this?
Sure. Sure. The question was about, it regarded the Susan Sontag quote at the beginning about imagery and, about my use of imagery and more broadly the use of cultural institutions to fight genocide. I began writing about columns about Darfur at the beginning of 2004, but no column that I did really attracted the response in 2005. I got Time's permission to run 4 big photos on the op-ed page on a Sunday of people who'd been killed. And I think that that's because when people can tune out dead ink, ink on dead trees. It's harder to tune out a photo. It creates a little bit more of that empathy. And so I've been, wherever possible, trying to use photos on the website, use these videos to try to build that connection, because I think that, you now having seen these videos, I think you're more likely to go home and call the White House or call your member of Congress because you've seen it, because it's a little more real. And I do worry a little bit about the Susan Sontag point about, the kind of the voyeur quality, and there's almost a point at which you show these horrific images and it becomes kind of genocide porn in a sense. These really horrific, but in a sense violently titillating images. But I must say that I worry about that less and less sure there's a danger there, but that's not killing anybody. In the meantime, hundreds of thousands of people have died in Darfur because Americans can't relate to what's going on. And so increasingly, I find the most wrenching photo that I can and put it up because, that is what I think is going to really galvanize viewers and people to get them to respond more. And TV, I think, for that reason, is a more powerful media institution than the newspapers or magazines. In terms of cultural institutions, the Holocaust Museum in Washington has been just fabulous. They've really led the effort since 2004, led by a man there called Jerry Fowler to call attention to what is going on in Darfur. And I just really applaud that the best way to honor victims of past genocide isn't to build museums to them and memorials, it's to prevent the next genocide from going on. And I would contrast what the Holocaust Museum has done in their real leadership against the Darfur genocide with the French Assembly, which recently passed a law making it a crime to deny the Armenian genocide. And I mean, I'm all for honoring the Armenian genocide, but the best way to honor that genocide isn't to criminalize discussion of it, it's to get active in Darfur, and that is what France has completely dropped the ball on. To the extent that, as I said at the beginning, that ultimately, if this is going to stop, and if the next genocide is going to stop, it's not going to be because the White House and Congress is going to show leadership on it. It's going to be because civil society and students and everybody else is going to lead the way and is going to embarrass our political elites. Then, to that extent, that's exactly what cultural institutions can do. And I just wish that there were a movie. At some point there's going to be a movie, Hotel Darfur. I just wish that it were coming out now, rather than 10 years from now.
Hi, Mr. Kristof. My name is Pat Fox. I'm a second-year business school student here at Dartmouth. First of all, thanks for coming. Secondly, my question surrounds kind of two issues encompassed into one, and that is the no-fly zone. You have been a proponent of it, and many other large organizations who speak on this issue have been a proponent of it. Really, what that boils down to is a small minority of people, U.S. people, that being the military, the Air Force in this instance, and the Navy and the Marines, making large sacrifices. These are the same minority that's been making tremendous sacrifices for the last 5.5, 6 years. Why not encourage some of these people here, the young people who have this motivation, who have these altruistic goals, to get involved on that side too, and encourage them to become leaders in that sense? Secondly, I participated in the last UN no-fly zone, both in northern and southern Iraq, which they continuously, neighboring countries ignored UN mandates and it proved somewhat ineffective. What do we do when this one proves ineffective? What's the next step? And what do we do when we shoot that plane down and we kill people and the Arab world revolts?
Sure. In response to the first part about it, I mean, I absolutely would encourage students to to go and work with aid groups there. There isn't really a way of working on the problem for ordinary people unless you're working for an aid group, and aid groups don't normally hire somebody unless they've got some special ability or some bit of their background. You can't get a visa into Sudan and so on. But for those who could work for an aid group, it is an incredibly satisfying thing to do, and one that you will just never forget. So absolutely. That said, I think that a no-fly zone is going to be part of the solution, and you obviously have to weigh the fact that that there are, that some people who are disproportionately taking those risks, and as you say, those are the same people who are disproportionately taking the risks in Iraq now. But I was against the Iraq War. I think that there are some cases where military intervention, humanitarian intervention, is called for. In the case of a no-fly zone, I think the risks are to the military enforcing it are relatively modest. They would be based in Abéché in Chad, which is a secure area. There are a lot of French planes and pilots there already. And the risk would be anti-aircraft fire from Sudan. Sudan's anti-aircraft abilities in Darfur are pretty primitive. And as I said, the way we would enforce the way that the military planners have proposed enforcing it isn't to actually shoot down a plane that is in the air. It's to monitor Sudanese aircraft, and when they fly a plane for military purposes in Darfur, then afterward we shoot it on the ground, strafe it on the ground. Now the risk there, frankly, is that there will be orchestrated riots afterward, and Sudan's government will organize a bunch of people, make it look as if it's a grassroots thing, and will go and string up a bunch of American aid workers or journalists. To the extent that I'm traveling in that area, I certainly wouldn't want that plane to be destroyed when I'm in the neighborhood, and other aid workers, feel the same way. But after year after year after year of seeing that, there is a real longing for tougher action, and I think that that action of destroying planes on the ground, would be the kind of action that I think there's only a marginal gain in preventing Sudan from bombing villages. That would be nice, but most of the action is really on the ground. The bigger gain would be putting pressure on Sudan and leading them to make more concessions politically that would make a peace agreement more likely. I think that in that trade-off, it would be well worth it. And I should also just say that those aid workers on the ground, they are unbelievably heroic. The risks they put up with. Doctors Without Borders, especially the French section, they're always sort of difficult to deal with. they're always, just, very, very French sometimes. But, I remember one time going to a village called Caloi, and all the word was that it was about to be attacked by the Janjaweed. Everybody who was able to had fled Caloi. The police were fleeing when I got there. We got to this clinic that had been abandoned by everybody, and it was I had my driver park car out. We were ready to run. It was terrifying. All the villages right around Caloi were being attacked. So finally, I did my interviews as fast as possible, rushed out. And as I was leaving, two Doctors Without Borders cars, vehicles, were coming in. And of course, they stopped. They wanted to find out from us what the situation was like. And we told them, there it is. It's about to be attacked and so on. And they kept on going. And, I take off my chapeau to them. They're very, very gutsy people, and that is generally true of all these aid work, including this this young American woman I was telling about. So there is some really unbelievable courage out there.
Hi. You mentioned the word evil, and I guess especially when President Bush tends to call things evil when he wants to, I think that really stops us from really understanding what people's motivations are in general. And I guess my big disconnect with the research I've done on Darfur is understanding what motivates the Janjaweed, because you said yourself, it's not an ideological conflict with them, and most of them are recruited from more northern and much more southern areas.
Right.
And so they were not immersed in any sort of racial conflict, in any sort of religious conflict, or migrant versus farmer conflict directly in this area. And with around 500,000 dead and so many women raped, that's a lot of evil to recruit. So what is it utter poverty and the offer of money?
I think there are a few.
What
It's a fascinating question. It's one that I've tried to wrestle with. It's hard to report on because it is kind of awkward to interview the Janjaweed, but to the extent one can, I think it's a really interesting question, and we can. I guess the judgments that I've formed are that it's kind of complex. As you say, I don't think it's ideological at the top level. I think it's basically a very calculated decision that, we have this insurrection, we can negotiate, but that'll be a mess. It's just easier to wipe them out. That'll send a useful message to other parts of Sudan. They can't use the Sudanese army reliably in Darfur because a lot of the Sudanese army recruits are themselves Darfuris and wouldn't be reliable, and so this irregular militia is the best way to go about it. I think that for the members of the Janjaweed, one incentive has been the payment. Another big incentive has been the opportunities to pillage. They typically will steal the livestock in the villages they go to, and essentially the way you save money, your bank account, if you're a Darfuri, is you buy livestock, and they're branded, but that nobody's going to ask the Janjaweed for their the brand of their animal. And one time I got stuck actually in a Janjaweed area, and a bunch of Janjaweed kids came and helped push me out of the sand. Fortunately, Dad was off, probably wiping out Zagawa or something. But they had their huge herd there, and this one family had something like 400 head of livestock. That's a lot of money, and it was they'd probably started out with 20 and had risen that much. So I think pillage is a major incentive. And there have been these real tensions. And you talk to Janjaweed or Arabs, and they will say that, the Zagawa, they've been, or the Fur, they've been planting and blocking our cattle routes, or they've been using our wells, or 2 years ago they stole some of our animals. I mean, they have real grievances. And in many cases, I think those grievances are real. I think the African tribes really have stolen their animals and stolen their water and this kind of thing. So there is a level of animosity. But I think the other part of the equation is that if you look at what happens to a village, then typically maybe there'll be a few hundred Africans living in a village, and all of a sudden, typically at dawn, there'll be 300 or 400 Janjaweed who will surround the village, come roaring in jeeps, on camels, on horses, and maybe there'll be 50 people killed. If the Janjaweed were more effective, there would be everybody killed. There'd be 300 people killed in that village. So my sense of it is that a lot of the members of the Janjaweed are firing in the air. They're killing men, but they're not really doing the nastiest stuff. But in this group of 300 Janjaweed who attack a village, there's a group of people who are real pathological, just real sadists. And some of those maybe are the ones who have been released from prison. Maybe some of those are real incredible racists. And that the most brutal things, I think, are probably done by a minority within the Janjaweed. And that also helps explain why when people commit rapes, for example, or mutilations, or toss children into these burning huts, they often use racial epithets and say really terrible things. And I think that is because this is a smaller subset, and that most of the Janjaweed are out to steal animals, out to kill men, but aren't responsible for the worst atrocities. That's my own take on it.
Hi, Mr. Kristof. You haven't mentioned this yet, so I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but very, very recently the UN started to secure funding for a mission or intervention. I'm a little unclear as to which one. And I was wondering if there were any elements specific to Darfur that you thought had to be included for this mission to be a success.
I'm sorry, which mission is this?
To Darfur. I'm a little unclear
Okay.
whether it's an intervention or just a peacekeeping mission.
Yeah, there's...
Excuse me a minute, could you please repeat the question?
Okay, it's about the UN mission to Darfur, which is now kind of working its way through. What the UN envisions is ultimately a force of about 20,000 well-equipped troops, including an air capacity, both fixed wing and helicopter. And that would make a pretty big difference in Darfur, and the Security Council has approved that force. Initially, Sudan agreed as well. Then Sudan backed off and unagreed. After furious rounds of negotiation, then including, I think this is where China's pressure was very helpful, and also Saudi Arabia's, President Bashir of Sudan has now agreed to allow an initial force of about 3,000 UN troops into Darfur as a peacekeeping force, kind of under the aegis of an African Union force that is already there. And I think this UN force is, it's important. It needs to go there. The African Union force that is there, it has helped, but if it's only 3,000 troops, it'll help. It'll bring a little more security. I don't see any indication that President Bashir, even if he does admit these 3,000, is going to go beyond that to the full 20,000 that are needed. And those 3,000 Now the thought is that they will actually get to Darfur in October. I think Sudan is delaying and delaying and delaying. I wouldn't be surprised if they don't, get there at any time this year. So I'm skeptical of the notion that the way to deal with this is just more peacekeepers. I think that there's a tendency to reach for that solution in our arsenal, and I think it's, we need to do that, but ultimately I think that there are other steps that we need to apply more, and ultimately that, and especially putting more pressure on Sudan so that it makes real concessions that'll help reach a peace agreement.
We'll take one last question.
One last question.
Okay, I'm wondering, sir, going back, because you were talking about Chad, and obviously a lot of the people are getting some relief by getting away from things by getting into Chad. And what I was wondering is, first of all, Chad has got to have some upper limit on what they can absorb that way, for one thing. And then you said the further disturbing aspect was that, if I recollect correctly, that the situation in Chad itself is breaking down to somewhat. So I'm wondering whether that is going to worsen the whole crisis in the near future. Thank you.
Yeah, Chad is a desperate situation. I mean, when I first covered this, Chad was just fine, and one of the things that really impressed me was how Chadian villagers who had nothing, the Darfuris would come over, and they would share the nothing that they had, the little water that they had, the little forage they had, the little food they had, with those Darfuris. It really impressed me. And these days, you go, and those Chadians have been driven out of their villages in the same kind of pogrom, also by the Janjaweed coming over from Sudan. So you have an area that extends a good 50 miles into Chad that is just this no man's land and incredibly scary to travel around in because of the Janjaweed. Sudan has made several efforts to send troops all the way into the Chadian capital and overthrow the Chadian government. It wants to put in a puppet government in Chad so that it'll have a friendly country next door. And Chad has kind of a nasty government, and I think as a result the U.S. hasn't been as supportive of Chad as it should have been. My view is that, Chad's president is, a real SOB, but at a time when a genocidal neighbor is invading you and gouging out people's eyes with bayonets, that it's worth supporting an SOB. And so I think we should be much more supportive of Chad. And also, if Chad collapses, you may not be able to put the pieces together again. And if Chad collapses, then its client state, Central African Republic to the south, is going to collapse as well. I hate to think of what will happen if Chad collapses, and there's a real risk of that. Sudan its military operations are in grave jeopardy now. It thought it was going to have a military solution to wipe out the rebels, and now it's under real pressure. And so I think it's less capable of invading and overthrowing Chad right now than it was. So Chad looks a little sturdier now than it did. But there are already 200,000 plus Darfuris in Chad in a very fragile border area. So you're right, there's not a lot of space for them to go to. One of the things that I've advocated is to send in peacekeepers on the border of Chad and Sudan on the theory that, even if we can't get peacekeepers immediately into Darfur, we can at least keep the Janjaweed from crossing over into Chad and into Central African Republic. And I still think we should do that, but it is also fair to say that if we do that, and if Chad is stable, then you will get swarms of people coming across from refugee camps inside Darfur into Chad, into a safe haven. I mean, you could have another 300,000 people crossing over into Chad, and that is a real problem. But the alternative of not having a safe haven in Chad is that these people die. So I think it is worth that risk. But ultimately, the way we're going to solve the crisis in Chad and the crisis in Central African Republic is to put more pressure on Sudan and to solve the problem in Darfur itself. So with that, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here.